C parking lot was the third one over from the terminal gate. It was a quarter of a mile exactly from where she had landed at gate 6. In fact, she was feeling her unused muscles as they began to strain under the load of her bags. She thought back on her mother and wondered if she should have said all that to her. Then she thought of Echo and knew she had been right. A thing like guilt was transferable and negotiable. Kelly, Kaina, and Echo had all spent time passing the guilt ball back and forth in a hideous game of handoff. Kaina had initiated a guilt and passed it to Kelly, who had handed it back to her with airline tickets. Kaina then realized she had it again, and so she tried to give it back to Kelly, but instead Echo wound up giving it back to Kaina, who was all but unaware she had given it to her at all. Now Kaina wanted Kelly to pay for what guilt Kaina was having over leaving Echo in Ohio, and no wonder soap operas sounded like they did. Who was guilty, though, for real? Don. It was Don who was the guilty one, not Kelly, Kaina, nor Echo. It was Don who was most likely going to never feel any guilt at all, but it was Don who was guilty all the same. Men do not feel guilt, she reasoned, for if they did, they would not put their women through so much. Don would have wooed Kelly for a long time before making her decide on him for life. There would have been a lot of presents for Kaina to win her love and affection. There would have been a lot of pleasant days and picnics while she and her mother decided on whether or not this man would be good for them both. There would have been none of this running off shit either. "Where are my presents, Donald?" Kaina asked herself. "No presents, Kaina. He's not purchasing you. He's purchasing Mama. You are of no consequence to him. You are somebody else's mistake." "Oh, Donny boy," she thought, "I'm going to make you notice me. I'm going to make sure that you never forget who you went tangling with, and how it did turn out. When I'm through with you, I'll have you so concerned with my well-being that Kelly herself will get jealous." She smiled deviously. She found the little car with the tag ZYZ 686. It was sort of like blue lettering with a small green tree in the dead center of the characters. How quaint for a license plate. How positively rural of them. They've got trees, do they? How nice. Well, what cash crop did come from Oregon anyway? Oregano? The car was soon loaded, and that new car smell was making her very happy as she sat down behind the wheel, in the space-aged cockpit driver's seat. She looked over all of her instrumentation and determined what was what. She was trying to remember how to drive from driver's ed class. There was a moment before she could determine the dimmer switches from the signals and the washer pumps from the cruise control. It was as her mama had once said when they had rented a car to go somewhere. They put everything on a damn twig and expect you to know how to use it. Well, here was her twig, and if she molested it enough, it would control half of the automobile's extemporaneous functions, all from a single twig. She placed the key into the ignition, turned it, and delighted as it caught and fired perfectly for her. A large silver "Thank you for not smoking" was superglued onto the wide dash piece in a most tacky manner. Definitely rental car decor. The gas gauge read full, and the rest of those gauges passed her attention in a blur. They were meaningless to her. All she understood was fuel. She backed out of the parking space with righteous care, and she carefully made her way down to the end of the line of cars, looking for the exit. She soon found it, and then the sign leading her out to Highway 26. It was almost too easy, she thought, as she went down the long ramp that led out onto the open highway. But Highway 26 wasn't as forgiving as she thought. Getting onto the road was easy enough, because the acceleration lane turned into her own actual lane. This was so she wouldn't have to count on the courtesy of other drivers to let her in front of them. This was much nicer, she thought. She was just settling back to enjoy her ride when a tractor-trailer strafed her too closely, causing her to flinch in surprise. Dirty old truck, belching foul-smelling smoke into the air and right into her window. She could almost taste it, it was so strong. She said a few choice, Echo-approved words and closed her window to keep the mess outside of her car. There was AC in this baby. Might as well use it, if I can figure out how it works. She finally got the air conditioner cut on, and then she even figured out how the radio played. The presets eluded her, but she wasn't so hung up on music that she had to have a certain song or a certain type of music. She found an easy listening station that was coming in good, and she listened to Hal Stewart sing, "You know sometime you're bound to leave her, but for now you're gonna stay in the year of the cat." She liked that song. Traffic was trying to get under her skin, either whipping in too close when she was in the passing lane or driving too slowly when she was in the left lane. Kayana phased them out of her mind as Gordon Lightfoot rambled on about the Edmund Fitzgerald. That was one of her favorites. All of these songs were her songs. She had just not recognized that she liked them until this moment. They were from her time, her upbringing. She always liked them, despite Kelly's and Echo's obsession with Motley Crue and that god-awful Bam Bam Manson. What a whore she was. Gordon sounded sexy and yet wholesome. Why couldn't Brandy do that if she wanted to be a singer or an actress, or whatever the H she was? Kayana really didn't know. Why couldn't Brandy be dressed and decent? Why did she have to glorify all that was evil in the world and make sex out to be the porno book everyone wanted it to be? Sex was a beautiful act if it was done right. Kayana didn't just dislike Brandy Manson, she loathed her, probably screwing every Tom, Dick, and Harold on the set just to prove she could do it in under an hour. Echo was young, confused, and forgivable. She was also a decent person to know and love. But Manson, Brandy probably got what she deserved, out with a bunch of fag hags like the ones they had interviewed. These people were communicable in diseases just by close association. Brandy probably wasn't kidnapped at all. She was probably absorbed into the filthy tissues of one of her scum buddies who had his mind up his dink the night that she was taken. Sort of like an in utero cannibalism. She smiled to herself. She was clean and she liked being clean. A clean girl can always make herself dirty, but a dirty girl has one hell of a time cleaning herself up. She knew that as far back as Angie Markham. Kayana and Mrs. Cherbourg had discussed lots of things before, including old songs. "Old songs, Kayana," Mrs. Cherbourg had told her, "are like an aging husband. He's not new, and you don't want him to be new either. You want him like you know him. He knows you inside and out, and he's slow and good." Kayana recalled blushing like a bride in front of the old lady. "He's finally on your wavelength and speed. He's enough of a woman in himself to be really a man for you. He's absorbed so much of you into his system that he's actually pleasing himself when he pleases you." Kayana liked the thoughts of that. Kayana recalled Mrs. Cherbourg glancing over at the picture of her dead husband on the table as she said, "And you're finally man enough to appreciate what he's trying to do for you. You absorb enough of him in time to actually let him be pleasing himself when he pleases you. The man and the woman are no longer man and woman, Kayana, but they become each other, and it's beautiful. It really is. They really do become one flesh. You'll see this first with music, Kayana, when you finally know what songs you remember liking. One day you'll be riding down the road and you'll hear a song that takes you way back. It does this, Kayana, and you will see that the song and you are close in your memory. It exists and you exist, but in your mind it's part of a thing you remember, and that's what happens when the right man comes along and stays with you for years." Kayana finally realized that Mrs. Cherbourg was telling her to look for a man to replace her mama. Kayana had had to laugh. One day little Echo would hear Motley Crue and a tear would come to her eye. That was hysterical. Kayana was glad that her music was less shocking to the aged system. "Well, I did come out here to cauterize myself against Kelly and my irrational fear of losing her. If I can see that she's all right, and I can get a big belly full of Don, I might get to go back to Echo again and Mrs. Cherbourg." Kayana recalled Mrs. Cherbourg patting Kayana's hand when she had told her about husbands and all, and as Kayana had blushed so deeply, she said, "The most beautiful thing about a woman, Kayana, is her modesty. Never forget that." Kayana had never forgotten it either. Satisfied that she wanted to be modest, she drove on down the highway alone. "Bridge Over Troubled Water" by Simon and Garfunkel, "Cracklin' Rosie" by Neil Diamond, "Summer Breeze" by Seals and Croft. These were the songs she was hearing now. They were indelibly printed on her mind. She drove on now just to herself, happy in the knowledge that she could think anything she wanted to think right now, and no one would overhear her. She decided that she might like to live alone. She would certainly have to develop a lot more of herself if she was going to do without anyone else, but she was going to have to really develop herself if she met a man anyway. There were a lot of men out here, according to Cosmopolitan magazine, who were after dependent types of women that they could dominate and control for their own use. Screw that. Kayana drove along now, looking at the scenery around her. Fairview, Gresham, Boring, Sandy. These were the names of places near here that came up on signs. These came and went, and Kayana had not even noticed them until she saw them on her map. She had dawdled away the miles between these places, and she was surely glad. Names like Brightwood, Zigzag, Rhododendron. These places all sounded really swell, they really did. But for Kayana's money, they could have just moved Ashwood a little closer to Portland and dispensed with all this unnecessary crap in between. All these tongue-in-cheek towns. Mount Hood Wilderness Area lay off to her immediate left. Whoopee! Sounded like a great place to get lost and never come out again. She was still about 75 miles from Madras, she calculated. Have to get some gas in Madras, if they have any there. They'd have to have some, wouldn't they, for trucks and all? Kayana mentally took stock of her on-board supplies she was carrying with her, and she decided it was time for a Dr. Pepper break. Up ahead was what appeared to be a small roadside store. It was called a Little Darlin', and there was a small lady on the sign in a red dress with a parasol. She was smiling sweetly at Kayana, who wondered if she was anything at all like an IHOP. IHOPs they had back in Canton, and 7-Elevens. Out here they must be called Little Darlins. Well, they had gas pumps out in front, and she saw unleaded. Better whip in and get some. She tore out one of Kelly's traveler's checks, American Express, of course, and she got out to pump herself some gas. She pumped about $8 worth and refitted the cap and pranged the maroon lid shut again over the hole. It made a nice fit. She walked inside the store a little bit stiff, and she stretched her buttocks and hamstrings to loosen her body from the sitting position. It felt good to stand up after all that driving, and it felt even nicer to take her little bag into the well-lit bathroom and take care of business. She emerged from the restroom fully rested and refreshed, and she walked over to the disinterested lady who was guarding the cash register. Kayana paid for her gas, got a 6-pack of ice-cold Dr. Pepper, and a small styrofoam cooler that looked as if it had been designed to last exactly one trip before it fell into a million fragments of blue and white dandruff. "And I want a bag of ice, please, ma'am," said Kayana. "How much altogether?" The lady added up the figures and told her it would be $11.50. Kayana nodded and was just about to pay when she saw a great old big bag of Lay's vinegar and salt potato chips. She tossed those up on the bar and continued writing on the traveler's check. "You want them as well?" asked the lady. Kayana looked up at her with pure tolerance and smiled. "Please," said Kayana, batting her eyes at the lady. The lady rang up her purchase, and then went back to reading her book, Atlas Shrugged, a paperback that had more yellowed age on it than the woman herself did. "You definitely do not win the Cherbourg Award for this year, Grandma," thought Kayana to herself. "Echo and I will be great old ladies. Oh, yeah. We will adore young girls who want only to know what took us a lifetime to acquire, and we will make aging look like pure freaking fun." Kayana put her ice in the cooler and then her Dr. Peppers. She put her cooler into the car, in the floorboard of the passenger side, where she could get at it. Then she drove over to a small picnic area and took out a Dr. Pepper and her bag of chips for a snack. As she parked her car, she got out and walked slowly over to the table to sit in the afternoon sun and enjoy herself. She allotted herself exactly 15 minutes of downtime to recharge, and she sat down on the hard bench. The ice-cold Dr. Pepper was great, and her chips gave her a salt and grease rush she really needed. She didn't want to be accused of diddling, young lady, so she would take only 15 minutes and no more. She was feeling terribly adult right now, and it was feeling very good. The air was silent. No breeze blew. It was as if the lull was so she could see the intense colors in the trees. The fall was a lot longer here than in Ohio, because there were more trees out here. She sat and watched the scenery. The cars on the highway went by, the direction she would be going, and some were coming from the direction that she was going, as though they had already been there. It was very peaceful for a while. The lull did seem a bit unnatural, though. What made it so unnatural was the feeling of certain dread Kaina was having. How could she possibly feel dread sitting out here on an otherwise perfect afternoon? A day like this could certainly harbor no horror of any kind. She wanted to just say to herself that this was all in her head, a product of menstruation, bad vibes from within. Certainly nothing that a day like today could cause. She figured that she was alone, and that her only problem with the day was the fact that she was alone. Once she saw her mama again, she'd be fine. "Let me enjoy myself today," she told Kaina. "I want to be feeling good when I see Mama. Quit pestering me about my irrational fears." Herself did not answer her. She sipped another burning swallow of her Dr. Pepper and crunched another pinch of potato chips. She was almost halfway through the bag, they were so good. She craved vinegar and salt potato chips. The afternoon wound on around her, and all too soon her 15 minutes became 20, and then a half an hour. She felt the weak sun as it tried to come out a couple of times, to hit her in the face with its sickly beam. She did feel it heat her up. "You're diddling, young lady," she told herself. Groaning, she opened her eyes. Time to go. The distant valley across the highway was green and brown, with mottled sunlight occasionally dappling the hillside. What a gorgeous painting that would make, thought Kaina. She wished for her mother's camera, for this one shot alone. She'd have to carve it deeply into her memory so she wouldn't forget what it looked like. She mentally snapped the scene and stood up. What was this feeling of dread, she wondered. The breeze was back now, and a light wind made her aware that she had perspired under her arms and beneath her shirt. Her breasts were hot, and she wanted to fan them. Now the AC would take care of that. As she got back in the car, the dread had passed for the moment. Kaina was glad to be back underway. Her little stop had done her a whole world of good, and she felt terrific now. Kaina did not notice that she was now alone on the highway. No cars were with her for a while, and she drove on down the deserted stretch of highway that passed by the Wapanesha Pass. It was a beautiful ride for Kaina, with all the leaves still turning, even if it was a bit lonely. Still, Kaina's dread had been quelled back at the Little Darlin', and she was feeling too good to notice the slight changes in the weather outside of her car. All she noticed was that she could kill the air conditioner now and save on gas. She didn't notice the ominous end of the Chinook wind she had felt coming out of Portland, with its dry warmth fading into the cool of autumn and the cold, by nightfall, of pure winter. None of this would register. She wouldn't understand what an old Indian would have known quite readily. The storm was on its way. Chapter 6. Don was sitting at the table, watching Star Trek III on the large-screen television in the other room. It was almost over, but it was coming in for free on his satellite dish, so he didn't care anyway. He'd seen it 3 times already. It would be on tonight again, most likely. Kelly had seen it before as well, but her memory of it was better than Don's. Don didn't retain much of plots and dialogues when he would watch a movie, not like Kelly did. He wasn't into much of that. In fact, he wasn't into much of anything, except one thing. Kelly was rubbing his shoulders. They were as tight as they could be, and her fingers ached as she tried to loosen him up. He had been splitting firewood, and his huge arms, healthy after years of an inner-city gym, might as well have been carved out of pure mahogany. She'd never get to working these knotted muscles out. He claimed that splitting firewood and finally doing real work again was no comparison to lifting weights at all. Weightlifting, while it made you pretty to look at, didn't do a damn thing for your endurance, nor your overall stamina. The tightness in his arms was from all those little groups of muscles that the weights had not gotten down to developing. Real work would make a bodybuilder or a weight trainer as rigid as steel piping after a few hours. Unable to move, Don had been bitching about how those weights had made him muscle-bound, tied down by his own misshapen muscled body. He claimed that the real work developed the body naturally and didn't give you the easy outs of weight training. He claimed that weight training was really useless in a way, for no real work was ever accomplished. Not like splitting firewood and toting logs. Kelly tried to ignore all of this macho talk, and didn't turn her on one little bit to hear what a hunk he was. It was about as exciting as a woman trying to tell a man how large her nipples were while she was lactating, and how much milk she could produce in a given amount of time. Don's muscles didn't do a thing for her, except when she wanted him. Like right now, she wanted him. Kelly wanted to be friendly this afternoon, and she wanted to try and make him think that it was his idea. She didn't want to ask him outright, but she wanted him to get the message. She had bathed in some special type of bath oil he liked, and she had innocently cologned herself a bit to try and entice him. She was wearing her oldest, thinnest pair of blue jean cutoffs, the obscene ones that she couldn't wear to the city pool, and she had on a halter top with tiny little straps. She wasn't wearing any shoes. She looked like an errant farm girl, fresh from a walk along the riverbank. She got up next to him and felt the pleasure of closeness, the kind she got with Kaina, and with other touchy things like furs and leather skins. It wasn't yet the wanton lust, but it felt erotic, and it made her feel good. The more she rubbed his big shoulders, the better she felt. On the big screen in the other room, Kirk was kicking Christopher Lloyd in the face as he sent him to his death on the doomed Genesis planet. He knocked the Klingon down into a chasm that had just opened up beneath him. The planet was imploding or exploding or whatever it was planets did when they flew apart. She was hugging him tightly, but he didn't respond to this. The scene was all fiery red and orange, with flames and explosions, and he was watching it. She wasn't hugging Don for his pleasure, though. She was hugging him for her own. She was into these hugs so tight that she could feel the rich warmth of pleasure as it went from her breasts down into the pit of her stomach, and just a little bit below there. That feeling was just too good. It was almost as good as anything they had sexually. The hug, to Kelly, was addictive and potent. She managed. He didn't stop her, and that was good. Most ladies Kelly knew were turned off by men who weren't receptive at this point, but not Kelly. She had had solitary finger sex for so long that even the mere presence of a man meant his inadvertent participation. She knew her way around inanimate fantasy men, and Don didn't bother her one bit with his stoic, "Are we seduced yet?" attitude. In fact, she was rather grateful for it. One of the reasons Kelly was feeling frisky right now was because Kaina was coming to see her. Coming to see Mama tonight. Kelly had not wanted Kaina to know this, but she was about to wet herself with joy over being able to see her daughter again. They would hug and kiss and talk. A woman in the house again, and not just any woman, but Kelly's own flesh and blood. If Don had any idea how lonely it got sitting next to Sitting Bulled, he'd cut this crap off on the TV and turn around and say anything just to ease her silence. "Touch me, you lunk of muscle," she thought. "Even sexually. I don't care. Give it to me. If that's the only way you have of showing me emotion, give me what you've got in the way of love and feelings, and I'll fantasize the rest of it out of you." But Don's problem today was the fact that Kaina was coming, and she knew it. She knew that Don was acting like this because of her own daughter and the fun the two of them would have with girl talk and woman things. He'd feel stranded and left out. Kelly couldn't imagine why he would, as passionate and caring as he was to begin with. Right. He was a man, and men get left out of girl talk because they don't have any understanding of what it's all about. Girls talk about everything. It's the way they are. Girls enjoy being bonded together. There's a word for you, old boy. Bonding. Kaina and I want to bond, like boys do with football, and crap of that magnitude. Only we talk about important things like ourselves and each other. Don sat, bulled and without emotion, while Kelly pleasured herself against his body. It was nice to have a rubbing post like Don. She was being pleased, and he was allowing it. Not a bad trade-off. But it wasn't quite intercourse. Well, if she didn't think about it, she wouldn't need intercourse, she didn't think. Hugging Don and hugging Kaina were about the same thing to Kelly, but she knew that Don wouldn't understand the difference. He couldn't grasp the concepts of womanly affection at all, not even during his own sex. She couldn't get him to see that Kaina wasn't her lover, nor had she ever been her lover in all their 18 years together. It wasn't like that. But Don wouldn't know. He was figuring that she had remained manless for all those years, and the reason was Kaina. Well, all right, so she enjoyed Kaina totally, but she didn't want to marry her. The right man doesn't come along every day, and even passable men like Donald Blue weren't a dime a dozen. Besides, her daughter was out of her own body, and she loved her own body, didn't she? Did that make her strange or queer? Did it? Of course not. But just try and tell that to this Neanderthal. Kaina provided Kelly with emotional support, and right now she was having about as much Kaina withdrawal as Kaina was having on her way out here. You stupid hunk, thought Kelly. If you had half the brains you're supposed to have, you know that I need hugs and kisses. And I trade you intercourse to get them. I do that for you, Pac-Man. I do that because men have to have that, or at least they think that they do. But logic, Mr. Spock, would dictate that a woman who lives with her overly affectionate daughter for 18 years and doesn't have a boyfriend has needs that a man doesn't need to fulfill. Those needs are contained in affection, you stoop. Kaina gives me affection, and so did you until I said, I do. After that, you did not think of affection. All you thought about was up and down. But I know that Kaina will be leaving me again soon, even though she's coming out to visit. It will be a short visit, and I want her to get a partner for life of her own. So for my life partner, I pick you, and what do I get? A rubbing post. Well, if that's all I get, I'll take it. I'll pretend I'm a house cat. But don't give me any hard time about my daughter coming out here and wanting to hold me for a few minutes, or I'll break that 20-inch arm of yours off at that incredibly tight shoulder muscle, and I will beat you to death with it. Didn't your mother ever even touch you, Don? She asked herself. She stared out over his head at the screen in the other room. Don was still watching the movie intently, despite Kelly's love rubs and wishes. Yes, he was receiving her loud and clear, but Kaina was coming, and she'd probably be here sooner than expected. Then it would be Kelly and Kaina and Donald, who? He would have to sleep on the couch while she rubbed Kaina's cramps out of her stomach, and she would have to have a drink of water or something. There would be no more time for Don and all of that feminism. There would be no more mail room in his own house. Soon, before the day was out, Kaina would take her sanguinary place next to Mother again. Blood is thicker, a lot thicker than marriage. 3 was about to become the proverbial crowd in his own little world. Damn Kaina. Why wasn't Kaina out there trying to get laid like every other healthy, normal 18-year-old girl? He shook his head and distracted Kelly from the movie. The movie had reached the part where Talar is standing between McCoy and Spock, preparing to do the thing called foul torpan, the refusion. It was referring to taking Spock's conscious thoughts and mind out of McCoy's head, where Spock had placed them at the end of Star Trek II, when he had died. McCoy had, by mind meld, received all of Spock's mental wiring through his Vulcan fingertips to save the essence of Spock. Spock, who had given his life to save the Enterprise. Talar was going to duplicate McCoy's mental tapes of Spock back into Spock's own brain again. The old woman stood between the two figures as they lay there, and Kelly couldn't help but notice that, at last, the two good-natured foes, McCoy and Spock, were at last going to have a meeting of the minds. It was never clear to Kelly exactly how Spock's body had come back to life at all, but somehow it had been resurrected down on the Genesis planet. His body was now rapidly gaining full adulthood, but all of the past experiences were erased, unless Talar could pull off this foul torpan thing out of McCoy's head. They were both watching the movie now, as intently as if it had been the first time for both of them. The old woman, Talar, said something that sounded like, Vim val navum. The refusion had been started, and fire crackled and lightning flashed, and etc. and so on. Kelly smiled down at Don. Now she wanted the refusion with him. She wished foul torpan between them, and she wanted him to fuse with her. She thought of the perfect way to give him the hint, in order to carry out her wishes. The lower part of his ear. She placed her teeth firmly around his left ear, and she pulled her lips back in a grimace. She now had the tender meat of his ear between her sharp little teeth, and she wasn't going to let go even if he flinched. He knew this. They played their games a little rough, but she liked it, and he loved it. There was the faintest trace of sadomasochism in him as well as in herself, and they did play it well together. "Yes," he whispered, sniffing, as the pain in his lower ear began to get his attention and distract him from his movie and his hateful thoughts about Kaina. She started to hum against his ear and nearly drive him out of his mind. He had to remain still, or else he'd leave a big chunk of his lobe between her teeth. He was careful not to jerk or anything until she released him. He knew what she wanted before she hummed it. Vim, she hummed against the side of his head. Val navun. Without looking, she felt for the remote control in his lap, still biting his ear. She wanted foul torpan. Don almost laughed. She managed to get the remote control in her left hand, and she was aiming it at the wall in the other room. She fiddled with the switch, unable to see it, until she had 3 buttons to the left and 4 from the top. This button she pushed, and the great picture of Spock in his white robes, looking dazed and confused, clicked off. Totally sacrilegious of her to do that, thought Don. She had brailled the television off, and she still had Don's ear tightly between those very sharp white teeth of hers. Her lips pulled back vampirically to form words. She dropped the remote into his lap, banging him on his member just enough to make him flinch, but not enough to cost him his ear. She did hear his breath catch. She had his attention. Vim, she hummed again. Val navum. His ear vibrated between her teeth. I know, said Don dangerously. I also know how close you and the kid are. She drew away, totally quelled by his remark. What a blow to her mood. She had to admit that. He did get her goat that time. She had left a crescent of red teeth marks on his ear as she drew away from him, sighing loudly in disappointment. Oh, shit. Kaina, said Kelly, almost angrily. The kid's name is Kaina. Yeah. Yeah, what? He said nothing as she stared at him. You wanted her to come out here, didn't you? Demanded Kelly. He looked at her strongly, staring down into her eyes, as if some meaning could be found deep within their gaze. I wanted you to quit worrying about her, Kelly. I wanted you to stop with all the phone calls and all the pining away you do in the bathroom at night. Kelly stiffened. She didn't think that he'd heard any of that. I don't know what the hell I wanted. She ran her fingers through his forelock lovingly. You wanted me to be happy, didn't you? He nodded silently. I am happy, she said, but you're not. Why? He sighed and didn't answer her. Finally he looked up at her and said, She has such an ungodly power over you, Kelly. I swear it's not natural. She hugged him from behind, drilling the point of her chin down into the top of his head. And you're afraid it will be like before? She asked sweetly. He nodded, causing her head to bob up and down with his, like faces on a totem pole would have to nod together. It happened to me before, said Don, not having to elaborate. She knew this story. You were afraid I might go back to Canton with Kaina and leave you out in this wilderness all alone? She asked him. He knew she was fishing now. Yes, that's what he feared, and she knew it. You know all about Mandy, said Don, referring to his only daughter from his only other marriage. He closed his eyes against the feelings this memory invoked. "My only daughter turned on me because of her mother," he said at last. "I was the monster, you know. She made me out to be the bastard. Mandy bought every word of it, and I didn't see her any longer after that." "How did she do that?" asked Kelly. "How did your wife turn Mandy against you, like you say she did?" "Propaganda," said Don. "He's a this and he's a that, morning till night. You know how women are. They do that shit. Mandy was at first afraid to write me. Then she didn't want to write me. Now she doesn't even know me." Mandy finally didn't even want to visit Don at all because of the severe tongue drilling she'd get when she got back home. "But Mandy's a grown woman now," said Kelly. "Why don't you write her and see if you can patch up what your wife tore between you?" Don grimaced and growled. He actually growled. "I did write her, and guess what?" "What?" asked Kelly. "She's just like her mother now. Isn't that sweet?" "Bitch. Both of 'em." Kelly recalled now his having told her all this before. He'd written to Mandy a month before he'd married Kelly, to tell her the good news and to invite her to the wedding. But Mandy had written him back some nonsense about he'd never really loved their mother anyway. Kelly was silent for a moment when he didn't continue. She added something else. "So instead of the mother turning the daughter," she said, ill-advisedly, "the daughter will now turn the mother." "Yes, Kelly, God, yes, that's what I fear. Now can I do anything to prevent this from happening?" She didn't move her head from his, but she knew he wanted to look her in the eyes as he waited for an answer. She kept her head totem-poled on top of his for a time, so he wouldn't see the spacey, far-away look she had in her eyes. She didn't know it, but he could see her quite plainly in the mirror across the room. He was looking directly into her spaced-out eyes through the reflection, and he could see her distant gaze. He saw that it was taking her far too long to answer that. Finally, Don reached up and removed her head gently from his own. "Kelly," said Don firmly, "I've done my child rearing, all that I was allowed to do. I'm through with daughters. Anybody's freaking daughter. You hear me, woman?" She lowered her eyes expectantly as he stood up and looked about for his old coat, that blue and black flannel thing that had needed throwing away years ago. He wrenched it onto his back, stiff and still tight as he could be, and he started over towards the door. "But that ain't the half of it, Kelly Jane Arbicum Blue," he said, raising his voice. "I don't want any more kids at all. I've at last decided on a fact now. I don't want your baby, and I don't want any of my own." She looked at him hurt. "So if you and baby Huey have got any intentions of taking off together for Ohio and leaving me out here, I suggest you pack your shit and take her car and go right back tonight. I mean that, Kelly." He looked at her, but he gave him no hint of any possible way he might have been right on that guess. Her face bore no clue of any kind. "If you aren't planning to pull that," he said, "then you can stay. But she is to visit, and then she is to go the hell back. Back to that apartment I'm paying for her to live in. Is that understood?" She didn't answer him. "Did you hear me, Kelly?" "I heard you," she said bitterly, tears forming in her eyes. "I have to protect what's mine," she was told. "I have to look out for my own interests, Kelly. When I was in Bell Aviation, I had to fight like a son of a bitch to keep a hostile merger here or there from wiping the rug out from under all of us. That was my job, and I succeeded." He waited for emphasis. "But I didn't do it by waiting until the wolf came to the door. I had to do it at the first sign of trouble. Lockheed, Grumman, McDonnell Douglas, they all wanted a piece of our ass, but I kept them away from us with sound practices. I had to make sure that they didn't catch us napping. Our stockholders were always convinced that we were the way to go, and not to split and divide with another firm. I had to make sure that we took first prize every time, Kelly." He waited for a response, but she offered none. "I know what's good for me. I know what I need. I need you without her. That I need, Kelly." He stepped outside and shut the door behind him, leaving her silently alone. She allowed the silence of the house to fall over her gently as the last of his rage echoed away. What had brought that on, she wondered. She was wanting to make love, and he wants to fight. That wasn't like him at all. Normally he would just get up and carry her upstairs to the bedroom, where they would be bouncing away in bliss for a couple of hours. Normally she'd have to fight him off her. Now she just had to fight him. Of course, normally, Kaina wasn't due to arrive in a few hours either. She leaned over, her frustrations tight within her supple body, and she put out her tongue and blew air forcefully around it. It was an act that Kaina called a raspberry. She closed her eyes and raspberried him good. Small flecks of her spittle crossed the table and into the floor in a shower of disgust. Bastard! Where do he get off being so damn high and mighty all of a sudden? Asked the purse-lipped Hattie McDaniel inside of her. Why he so bad-ass today for? He best tighten up, else he have his own bed at night, and that's for sure. Believe that. The colored slave from Gone with the Wind subsided within her again, leaving her alone with her frustrations. All because she was going to get to see her daughter today. What sort of a man was Donald Blue that he could deny her any happiness 1 month into their marriage? What man lets the honeymoon end that quickly? She looked out the window as he stood in the cold driveway, spitting into his hands and preparing to split some more firewood. She shook her head, realizing that for a lover she had given up her identity, her daughter, and most of her soul. The axe fell again and again as he released his tensions through his macho act. Oh, killer, she thought, run your splintery hands over me. Let me have your ache, you hunk. Piss on you, she thought, smacking the glass of the window hard enough to nearly break it. She turned around and went into the bedroom and got her wallet out. There, inside the clear plastic encasing, was the picture of Kaina and Kelly that hung over the living room wall. She looked at it and sighed. It's still there, she thought. The place is still in my name, and my daughter still wants to live there with me. Is he worth all of this? Do I want to have a man that bad, or is fantasy and fingers better? The picture had been taken with Kaina in the superior position over her seated mother. In the photo, it looked like Kaina was a woman of the world, and not the sniveling little neurotic who longed for mother to hold her again. Kelly was more of a proud parent looking at that photograph than she would ever be in real life. To her, Kaina was nearly perfect in that picture. Tall, strong, and self-reliant. Me and Kay, she thought. Maybe it's not too late to have it all back again. Maybe then Don would realize what a jackass he's being when it came to Kaina. Maybe he would learn, damn it, that blood is thicker than water, and that nothing in this world is thicker than blood. Nothing. Nothing at all, she said, as she folded Kaina and herself back into her wallet, closing the snap and closing her eyes. Kaina continued her pleasant drive through the countryside of Oregon, in the areas of Mount Hood National Forest and the Warm Springs Indian Reservation. The drive was pleasant now, the heat of Portland long behind her, and the cooling open spaces all around her, still replete with a lot of late-season foliage and flora. She felt happy, even alone now. Kaina realized that she would have to be a separate entity on her own one day, and she'd better be getting used to the day when Kelly and she would no longer share the closeness they were, even now, fast losing. She was beginning to think how that might not be so bad. The trees fell away for the most part, and she entered the reservation area. The highway cut right through this reserved area like a pale-faced intruder. The countryside was pretty, but the roadway marred the natural terrain as a great gray scar from some long-ago battle might have done. She looked for Indians, but saw none within sight of the highway. She wondered, from looking at her map, which side of the road the majority of them chose to live. From where she could see, it was like the Washington Zoo she had seen once on a field trip. A lot of animals hid behind the fenced-in areas, almost as if they wanted a passerby to think the place was deserted.